The morning I lost my daughter was the morning I stopped being a person and became a set of functions. Breathing, walking, carrying. I didn't lose her the way you're imagining. She was alive, strapped against my chest in a carrier I'd bought at a thrift store 6 months before the world started eating itself. I lost her in the other way, the way a father loses a child when he realizes he has no idea how to keep her alive. Past sundown. Her name is Wren. She was 14 months old the day we started climbing. She had her mother's dark eyes and my unfortunate stubbornness, which at 14 months expressed itself as a refusal to cry, even when she should have. That silence terrified me more than any scream could have. Babies are supposed to cry. Wren just watched. I should tell you what I was before this. I was a recording engineer at a mid-tier studio in Asheville. I mixed albums for bands you've half heard of. I knew how to coax warmth out of a vocal track and how to make a snare drum sound like a gunshot. I did not know how to dress a wound, read a topographic map, or start a fire without a lighter. My ex-wife, Donna, used to joke that I was the only man in western North Carolina who'd starved to death in a forest. She wasn't wrong. Dana died on day 3 of whatever this was. I don't use the word they use on the emergency broadcasts, the ones that played on loop for the first week before the stations went silent. I don't call them infected or turned or lost. I call them what they looked like to me the night they came through our neighborhood in Weaverville. Wrong. Something had gone wrong inside them, and the wrongness had eaten everything that made them recognizable as people. Dana went out to help Mrs. Linden across the street, who was standing in her yard at 2 in the morning, making a sound like a smoke detector running out of battery. Dana didn't make it back to the porch. I took Wren. I took the diaper bag, a case of formula, 3 bottles of water, and the car. The car lasted until the I-26 interchange, where a jackknifed fuel tanker had created a wall of stalled vehicles stretching in both directions. I saw people running between the cars. Some of them were running from the wrong ones. Some of them were becoming wrong as I watched. I walked. I carried my daughter. And I walked north because north meant mountains, and mountains meant altitude, and some desperate, illogical part of my brain told me that things born from fever and wrongness wouldn't climb. I was incorrect about that, but the lie kept my legs moving for 19 miles over 2 days, so I'll forgive myself for believing it. On the 3rd morning of walking, I found the road. Not a highway, a Forest Service road, gravel and dirt, switchbacking up the side of a ridge I later learned was called Roan Bald. The sign at the trailhead was brown with yellow lettering. NOA, a weather monitoring station, authorized personnel only. An arrow pointed up. I almost didn't follow it. The formula was running low, and Wren had developed a rash across her stomach from the carrier's friction against her skin in the August heat. Every rational calculation said to stay low, find a town, find other people. But I'd seen what other people were becoming, and I'd seen what towns looked like after the wrong ones moved through them. So I followed the arrow. The station sat at 6,200 feet, a squat concrete building with a corrugated metal roof and a chain-link fence around a cluster of instrument towers. It looked like something the government had built in the 1970s and then remembered to maintain exactly twice. The door was steel, painted gray, and locked with a padlock that looked newer than anything else on the structure. I set Wren down in the grass, in her carrier, in a patch of shade. She watched me with those silent dark eyes. I picked up a rock the size of a cantaloupe. 3 swings broke the padlock. What I found inside broke something else entirely. The interior smelled like old electronics and mouse droppings. A single room, maybe 20 by 30 feet, divided by a half wall into a front section with instrument panels and a back section with what appeared to be a cot, a utility sink, and metal shelving. Emergency lighting, a single fluorescent tube connected to what I assumed was a battery backup, hummed overhead, filling the space with the kind of blue-white pallor you associate with hospital corridors at 3 in the morning. The shelving stopped me. Floor to ceiling, bolted to the wall, stacked with supplies that no weather monitoring station had any business holding. Cases of MRS, military meals, sealed and dated, good through 2029. 30-gallon drums of water, 5 of them. A medical kit the size of a suitcase. Batteries, a hand-crank radio, wool blankets, a water filtration system still in its box, iodine tablets, 2 propane canisters, and a portable stove. Laminated cards with instructions for emergency protocols I didn't recognize. Someone had prepared this place. Not NOAA, not the Forest Service. Someone with access and foresight and a particular kind of anxiety that, it turned out, wasn't anxiety at all. It was prophecy. I brought Wren inside. I locked the steel door from within using a deadbolt I hadn't noticed from outside. I laid her on the cot, changed her diaper with the last clean one from the bag, and mixed formula with water from one of the drums. She drank. She slept. I sat on the concrete floor with my back against the shelving and cried without sound, because I had learned from my daughter that silence was how you survived. It took me 4 hours to inventory everything. The MRS would feed one adult for roughly 60 days if I rationed carefully. Wren was still mostly on formula and the soft foods I could mash from the MRE components. Crackers, peanut butter, the applesauce packets. The water drums, combined with the filtration system and a spring I could hear trickling somewhere outside the fence, meant dehydration wasn't the immediate threat. The medical kit contained antibiotics, bandages, antiseptic, a suture kit, infant fever reducers. Someone had thought of a child. That detail unsettled me in a way I couldn't yet articulate. The radio pulled in 2 signals. The first was the emergency broadcast loop, which by now I had memorized. Shelter in place, avoid contact with symptomatic individuals, do not approach military checkpoints without identification. The second signal was weaker, scratchy, and came from what sounded like a park ranger repeating coordinates and a single sentence. Cumberland Gap Station is holding. 11 souls. 11 souls. The phrase lodged in me like a splinter. Somewhere out there, 11 people had consolidated into something. A group, a unit, a word I wasn't ready to use yet, because the last group I'd belonged to was a family, and half of it was dead. That first night, I did 3 things. I sealed the windows with the blackout material I found folded beneath the cot. I set the radio to scan on low volume so I could listen for new transmissions. And I wrote Dana's name on the wall beside the door with a carpenter's pencil from the supply kit, because I needed proof that she had existed before I could begin the work of existing without her. Wren woke once at what I guessed was midnight. No watch, no phone. I'd abandoned the phone on the interstate when the battery died, and the screen became nothing but a black mirror showing me a face I didn't want to examine. She made a small sound. Not a cry, more like a question posed in a language she hadn't finished inventing. I held her against my chest and stood by the sealed window and listened. The mountain was quiet, not peaceful. Quiet the way a room is quiet after an argument loaded, taut, full of things that hadn't been said yet. I told Wren we were safe. It was the first lie I told in that station. It would not be the last. Day 4 was when they found us. Not people, the wrong ones. I'd gone outside at dawn to locate the spring. It was 50 yards east of the fence, a seep coming out of a rock face, cold and clear, trickling into a natural basin before disappearing into moss and root systems. I was filling a collapsible jug when I heard the sound of rhythmic, wet clicking, like someone snapping their teeth together without closing their lips. The woman was standing at the tree line. She was wearing a nurse's uniform, or what had been one. The left side of her face was swollen and darkened to the color of eggplant, and her jaw hung at an angle that told me it was dislocated or broken. The clicking was her teeth upper row, striking lower row in a compulsive mechanical rhythm that had nothing to do with cold or fear. She wasn't shivering. She wasn't afraid. She was scanning. I dropped the jug. The sound of water splashing on rock seemed to sharpen her attention, and her head tilted toward me with a speed that didn't match the ruined state of her body. I was 40 feet from the fence gate. She was maybe 60 feet from me, slightly uphill, with deadfall and scrub between us. What I remember most is the calculation, not fear calculation. If she moved and I moved at the same time, I'd reach the gate first. If she was faster than she looked, I wouldn't. Wren was inside the station. The door was closed but not locked, because I'd propped it open with a rock to let air circulate while I fetched water. I ran, not toward the gate, toward the station door. Straight line, shorter distance. I heard branches cracking behind me, but I didn't look back because looking back is how you lose a half second. And a half second was the entire margin between my daughter having a father and not. I kicked the rock free, yanked the door, and slammed it. The deadbolt slid home. Something hit the door from outside. 4 seconds later on a knock. Not a pound, but a flat, full body impact, like a bird hitting a window it mistook for sky. Then silence. Then the clicking again, muffled by steel and concrete. She stayed for 6 hours. I watched through a hairline gap where the blackout material didn't quite meet the window frame. She circled the building. She tested the fence. She stood beneath the instrument tower and stared upward at the anemometer spinning in the wind, apparently transfixed by its motion. Then, as the afternoon shadows lengthened, she walked back into the tree line and was gone. I didn't go outside again for 2 days. In that time, I learned things. I learned that the propane stove worked, but that I should use it sparingly. 2 canisters wouldn't last 40 days if I cooked twice daily. I learned that MRS were designed to constipate you, which was actually useful when your sanitation option was a bucket with a lid. I learned that Wren liked the texture of the MRE crackers and would gum them silently for 20 minutes, which gave me windows to think. I learned that thinking was dangerous, because thinking meant planning. And planning meant admitting I had no plan beyond staying inside this box on a mountain and hoping the world reassembled itself before the food ran out. Thinking meant us replaying the I-26 interchange, the bodies in the cars, the woman in Weaverville who used to bring us zucchini bread and who had become something that killed my wife. Thinking meant doing the math on formula. At Wren's current intake, I had maybe 30 days of powder. After that, I'd need to find food she could eat, which meant going outside, which meant the tree line, which meant the clicking woman or others like her. On day 6, the radio picked up a new voice. Male, young, terrified. If anyone can hear this, I'm on the Appalachian Trail near Carver's Gap. I have a broken ankle and no food. Please, I have a 9-year-old boy with me. Please. The transmission repeated every 10 minutes for 3 hours. Then it stopped. I did nothing. I need you to understand that. I heard a man begging for help for his child, and I sat on a concrete floor next to my sleeping daughter and did nothing. I told myself it was rational. Carver's Gap was, I estimated, 4 miles north along the ridgeline. through terrain I didn't know, past tree lines where the wrong ones could be standing like monuments to the end of everything. I had a 14-month-old. I had no weapon beyond a claw hammer I'd found in a toolbox under the sink. I had no medical training that could address a broken ankle. I had every reason to stay. Reason is not the same as righteousness, and I knew it even then. The voice didn't come back, not that day, not the next. I told myself they'd been found by someone else, rescued, carried to safety. I told myself the silence was good news. On day 8, I told myself to stop telling myself things, because every story I invented to justify my inaction was a brick in a wall I was building between who I was and who I was becoming, and I could already feel the wall getting high enough to cast a shadow. Wren took her first unassisted steps on day 9. Inside the weather station, on concrete, holding nothing, she stood up from a sitting position and walked 4 steps toward the cot before sitting down hard on her diaper. She didn't laugh. She didn't cry. She looked at me with an expression I can only describe as professional satisfaction, as though she had completed a task she'd assigned herself and found her performance acceptable. I clapped. The sound was enormous in that small space, and she startled. And for one terrible second, I thought I'd frightened her into crying, which would have been a sound that carried through walls and windows and into the woods where things listened. But she just blinked. Then she stood up and walked 4 more steps. My daughter learned to walk in a locked government building on a mountain while the world below was being consumed. I don't know what kind of origin story that is. I don't know what it means for who she'll become. I just know that I watched it happen and felt 2 things simultaneously. A joy so fierce it was indistinguishable from grief, and a terror that I would not be adequate to protect the person she was becoming. Day 10 brought the second visitor. Not wrong this time. Human, alive, and worse. I heard the footsteps, first heavy, deliberate, boots on gravel. Then a voice, male, calling out with the practiced authority of someone accustomed to being listened to. I know someone's in there. Saw the padlock on the ground. Open up. I was standing by the door with the claw hammer in my right hand. Wren was on the cot, occupied with a cracker. Through the gap in the blackout material, I could see a man in his 50s, heavy set, wearing a hunting jacket and carrying a bolt-action rifle slung over his shoulder. His face was sunburned and his beard was coming in white and patchy. He looked like every 4th customer at every hardware store in the region. "Name's Harlan Gear," he said. "I've been walking for 6 days from Johnson City. I know what this station is. I've been here before. And I know what's on those shelves. So don't play this like you've got nothing." I didn't open the door. Not yet. Instead, I called through it. "I've got a baby in here." Silence, then quieter. "How old?" 14 months. Another silence, longer this time. When he spoke again, something had changed in his register. Not softer exactly, recalibrated. "I'm not here to take anything from a baby. I'm here because this is the only hardened structure on this ridgeline, and I've got 2 people behind me who won't make it through another night in the open." I pressed my eye to the gap. Behind Harlan, at the edge of the gravel lot, 2 figures sat on the ground. A woman with her arm in a makeshift sling. A teenage boy staring at the sky. My mathematics had just changed. Their names were Colleen and Jerome. Colleen Voss was 38. A veterinarian from Elizabethton with a fractured collarbone she'd set herself using instructions she remembered from treating horses. Jerome was 17. Not her son. Not related to anyone she knew. She'd found him on the road outside Roan Mountain, sitting in a ditch beside a woman who had been his mother until approximately 2 hours before Colleen arrived. He hadn't spoken since. Harlan had found them both at a church that had become a temporary shelter and then become something else when 3 of its occupants turned in the night. He'd gotten them out through a window. The rifle had been fired once. He didn't elaborate. I let them in. I need to be precise about why. It wasn't compassion. I wish it were. It was the rifle. Harlan had a weapon that worked at distance, and I had a claw hammer and a door. The calculus was ugly but honest. 3 more mouths reduced my supply timeline, but 1 rifle and 1 man who knew how to use it extended my survival probability in ways that outweighed the food cost. I've never said that out loud before. I've never admitted that I opened the door because a man had a gun, not because a woman had a broken bone and a boy had dead eyes. But this is the truth of who I was on day 10. And if I clean it up, I'll lose the shape of what actually happened inside that station over the next 30 days. Harlan surveyed the supplies with the eye of someone who'd done inventory before. He counted MREs, estimated water, checked the propane, and delivered his assessment without sentiment. 5 people. 1 infant who eats less but needs specific nutrition. You've got 30 days if we cut to single meals. 20 if we eat like humans. He looked at me. You've been here 10 days, and you've been eating like a human. He wasn't wrong. I'd been consuming 2 MREs a day, plus crackers, plus peanut butter from the packets. Alone with Ren, I'd had the math on my side. Now I didn't. Colleen was more diplomatic. She examined Ren with the gentle competence of someone who spent her professional life handling creatures that couldn't tell you where it hurt. She checked the rash, found diaper cream in the medical kit I'd overlooked, and applied it while humming a melody I didn't recognize. Ren submitted to this examination with her usual silent composure. And when Colleen finished, Ren reached up and touched Colleen's face, which made Colleen inhale sharply and turn away to look at the wall. Jerome sat in the corner. He didn't eat the MRE I offered. He didn't drink water until Colleen brought it to him and placed it in his hands. He was tall, angular, with close cropped hair and fingernails bitten to the quick. His eyes were open, but they weren't receiving that they were projecting, playing a film on the inside of the world that I was grateful I couldn't see. That night, with 5 people in a room built for weather instruments, the social architecture of the station shifted. I was no longer a father hiding with his daughter. I was a member of something, and that something required rules. Harlan proposed them. 1 meal per day, evening. Communal. Water rations tracked with a pencil mark on the wall. Latrine duties rotated. The rifle stayed with Harlan. Perimeter checks at dawn and dusk, 2 people, never alone. No lights after dark. No sounds above a whisper after dark. And the baby? I asked. She's your department, Harlan said. You keep her quiet. We keep her alive. It was the first contract of the station, and it was unequal, and I knew it. And I signed it anyway because the alternative was Harlan and his rifle on the outside, and me and my hammer on the inside, and a teenager and a veterinarian caught between 2 men doing math on each other's usefulness. Day 10, 5 people, 1 room. The mountain outside, quiet and enormous and full of things that clicked in the dark. We were a group. We were not yet a family. The difference would almost kill us. The structure of days became its own kind of survival. I hadn't expected that the way routine could function as both scaffolding and sedative, holding you upright while numbing you to the vertigo of your actual situation. Mornings. Harlan and I did the perimeter check. We walked the fence line, checked the gate latch, scanned the tree line, listened. He taught me to listen the way a hunter doesn't, not for sounds, but for the absence of sounds. Birds going silent. The particular quality of stillness that meant something large was standing motionless nearby, breathing without hurry. He never talked during these checks. After, over the day's single luxury, instant coffee heated on the propane stove, rationed to a half cup each, he'd debrief. Not the walk, himself. Harlan had been a county building inspector for 31 years. He knew load-bearing walls, electrical code, septic systems. He knew which structures in Johnson City were built to last, and which were cosmetic frauds held together by contractors' shortcuts and homeowner denial. When the wrong ones came, he said, you could tell which houses would hold and which wouldn't just by looking at the roof line. A house is a promise, he told me on day 13. Most promises are made by people who don't know what they're promising. His wife had died 4 years earlier. Cancer, not the wrongness. His son lived in Portland, and they hadn't spoken in 2 years over something Harlan wouldn't name. When the broadcasts started, Harlan tried to call. No signal. He didn't try again. Colleen's story came in fragments, offered between tasks while filtering water, while checking Jerome's vitals, while helping me modify the carrier so Wren could sit more comfortably. Colleen had been driving to an emergency call, a horse with colic on a farm outside Hampton, when the first wave hit. She saw a man standing in a gas station parking lot pull another man to the ground and open his throat with his teeth. She kept driving. The horse was dead when she arrived. So was the farmer's wife. The farmer was standing in the barn, clicking. She'd run. She'd been running ever since, and the collarbone fracture happened on day 5 when she fell descending a ravine in the dark. She'd set it with duct tape, a tree branch, and what she called professional detachment, which I recognized as the veterinary equivalent of my recording studio calm. The ability to focus on technical problems while the world around you was distorting beyond recognition. Jerome remained silent. Not selectively, comprehensively. He didn't speak. He ate when food was placed in front of him. He drank when water was offered. He used the latrine bucket when directed. He slept in the corner with his knees drawn up and his arms crossed over his chest like a pharaoh's burial pose. Colleen watched him with the particular attentiveness of someone who understood that some wounds are internal and don't present symptoms until the organism has decided whether to survive them. On day 14, Jerome picked up Wren. I was by the sink. He was in his corner. She had walked, her range was expanding daily. 8 steps, 10, 12 across the floor toward him, drawn by what I don't know. Children are instruments that detect frequencies adults have lost the ability to hear. She stood in front of him and raised her arms in the universal gesture of up. And Jerome looked at her for what felt like the first time he'd looked at anything since entering the station. He picked her up. He held her against his shoulder. He closed his eyes. I took a step forward and Colleen caught my arm. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The grip said, "Let this happen." Jerome held Wren for 11 minutes. I counted because counting was how I controlled fear, and what I was feeling was a species of fear. The terror of watching your child perform a kindness you couldn't have orchestrated, in service of a healing you didn't understand. When he set her down, his eyes were wet. That night, for the first time, Jerome ate without being prompted. He reached for the MRE, opened it, and fed himself. Wren had done something I couldn't do. She'd made the group 1 person larger. Day 16 was when Harlan told me the food math didn't work. He waited until the others were asleep, Colleen on the cot, Jerome on a pad of wool blankets by the far wall, Wren in the carrier beside me, and he spoke in the low, flat tone of a man reading building code violations to a homeowner who thought their foundation was sound. At current consumption, we run out on day 34. That's with the rationing. That's with a single meal. That's with your daughter eating a quarter of what we eat. He paused. That's also assuming nobody gets sick and needs extra calories for recovery. I'd known this. Some version of me had been running the numbers since day 10, but I'd been running them in a soft, focus, approximate way that let me avoid the sharp edge. Harlan dealt in sharp edges. It was his professional training and his personal temperament, and perhaps the reason his son hadn't called in 2 years. "What are you proposing?" I asked. "Foraging. There's ramp growing on the north face. I saw it during the perimeter check. Likely service berries in the open patches. I've seen turkey tracks along the fence line." He glanced at the rifle leaning against the wall. "I can hunt. But hunting means sound. And sound means attention." This was the architecture of every decision in the station. Every action existed in a web of consequences that radiated outward like cracks in glass. Hunt a turkey, gain protein, lose stealth. Light the stove, gain hot food, lose propane. Go outside the fence, gain resources, lose safety. Every benefit was mortgaged against a risk, and the interest rates were lethal. "There's another option," Harlan said. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the wall where I'd written Dana's name. "Fewer mouths." The words hung in the fluorescent air. I felt my hand tighten on the hammer, which I'd taken to keeping within arm's reach at all times. Not because I thought Harlan was a threat, but because the world had taught me that the interval between non-threat and threat had collapsed to something smaller than I could reliably perceive. "Nobody's leaving," I said. Didn't say leaving, said fewer mouths. He finally looked at me. "The Appalachian Trail is 4 miles north. People travel it. Some of them will have food. We could trade medical supplies for calories. That kit's worth more than gold right now." Relief and shame arrived simultaneously. Relief that he wasn't suggesting what I'd feared. Shame that I'd feared it. Shame beneath that. That for one flickering instant, I'd done the calculation myself, which of the 5 of us contributed the least, consumed the most, could be subtracted with the smallest operational cost, and that the answer my survival brain produced had been Jerome. I'm telling you this because the point of this account is not to present myself as good. The point is to document what a person becomes when the floor is removed, and you discover what's beneath it. Beneath my liberal education, my studio professionalism, my curated record collection, my thoughtful co-parenting arrangement. There was an animal doing arithmetic on human lives. The animal wore my face and thought in my voice, and the only thing that separated me from it was the decision not to act on its recommendations. "Trade makes sense," I said. "But who goes?" "I go. You stay with the girl. Colleen stays because she can't climb with that shoulder. We need a second person." We both looked toward the corner where Jerome slept in his burial pose. "He's 17, I said. "He's tall, he's fast, and he hasn't eaten enough to slow him down. He knows these mountains. Roan Mountain's his town." Harlan stood. "We leave at dawn. 1 day out, 1 day back. If we're not back by sunset on the 2nd day, you lock this door and you don't open it for anyone wearing my face." The specificity of that instruction, anyone wearing my face, settled into me like cold water. I didn't sleep that night. I watched the door, and I listened to the mountain. Jerome spoke on day 17. His first words in 12 days. And they weren't directed at anyone in the room. They were directed at the air, or the memory of someone no longer in it. She used to hike this section, my mom. We'd do the out and back from Carver's Gap every spring. He was tying his boots. Harlan had given him a pair from the supply shelf, too large, padded with wadded socks. Jerome laced them with the careful attention of someone performing a ritual. Colleen sat on the cot, holding Wren, watching Jerome with an expression that flickered between maternal concern and clinical detachment. "You don't have to go," I said. Jerome looked up. His eyes had changed since Wren's intervention. They were receiving again, processing the exterior world, though what they processed still seemed to cause him a kind of ongoing, low-grade astonishment, as though he couldn't quite reconcile the station's fluorescent reality with whatever internal landscape he'd been inhabiting. "Yeah, I do," he said. "Mr. Gear's right. I know the trail. I know where the shelters are. I know where people cache things." Harlan handed him a section of aluminum pole from one of the instrument towers, unscrewed and repurposed as a walking stick or, if necessary, something else. The rifle stayed with Harlan. They took 4 MREs, between them 2 days eating and 3 bottles of water. At the door, Jerome turned back. He looked at Wren, who was watching him from Colleen's lap with her relentless, calibrating gaze. "I'll come back," he said. To her, not to us. They left at first light. I locked the deadbolt. Then I stood at the window gap and watched 2 figures cross the gravel lot, pass through the gate, and disappear into the tree line, heading north. The morning was cool. The sky, that particular shade of Appalachian blue that looks like it was mixed by someone who understood that beauty and indifference are the same color. Colleen and I existed in a different silence after they left. The station felt simultaneously larger and smaller, more space to move, less mass to absorb the anxiety. "He's going to be okay," Colleen said. And I understood that she was talking about Jerome, not Harlan, and that her investment in the boy's survival had crossed some threshold from professional to personal. How do you know? I don't. But I've watched animals decide to live after trauma. There's a moment when they start eating again, engaging with their environment. Jerome's past that moment. She shifted Wren to her good arm. Humans aren't different from animals in the ways that matter. We just narrate the process. I thought about Dana, about the moment I decided to live, which wasn't a moment at all, but a gradient, a slow, incremental tilting away from the paralysis of loss and toward the mechanical demands of keeping a 14-month-old breathing. Wren hadn't saved me through love. She'd saved me through logistics. She needed formula at specific intervals. She needed to be changed. She needed to be carried. The schedule of her needs became the rhythm that kept me upright. And by the time I realized I was surviving, I'd been doing it for days. "You're good with her," I said. "I miss touching living things that aren't in pain." Colleen looked down at Wren, who was methodically exploring the buttons on Colleen's shirt. "The last animal I touched before all this was a dying horse. 1,000 pounds of beauty, and it was screaming, and I couldn't save it. Then the farmer's wife was dead in the kitchen, and the farmer was in the barn. And he wasn't screaming because the ones who turn don't feel pain. That's the worst part, isn't it? They don't suffer. They just become." We didn't speak again for hours. Colleen napped, Wren napped. I sat by the radio and scanned frequencies, searching for the voice that had asked for help from Carver's Gap, the one I'd ignored, the one that might have belonged to someone Harlan and Jerome would find today, alive or otherwise. The radio gave me nothing but static and the fading echo of the emergency broadcast. The mountain held its breath. They came back on the evening of day 18, an hour before I'd have had to reckon with Harlan's final instruction. I heard them before I saw them boots on gravel. And then Harlan's voice, deliberately loud, deliberately identifying. "It's us. Open the door." The U.S. had expanded. Behind Harlan and Jerome, a woman I didn't know was carrying a child I didn't know on her back. and behind her, a man walked with the shuffling, cautious gait of someone whose feet had been damaged in ways he hadn't stopped to assess. 5 people had left the station as 2. 4 were returning. The woman's name was May Sutter. She was 32 and had been a high school chemistry teacher in Bakersville until day 1. The child, a girl, 6 years old, named Iris, was not hers. The man was Phelan, no last name offered, mid-40s, wearing clothes that had been expensive before they'd been slept in for 2 weeks. Jerome carried a backpack that hadn't left with them. Inside, 12 cans of food beans, corn, peaches, soup, a bag of rice, a box of powdered milk, and 6 bottles of water. Not a fortune, a reprieve. Found them at the Overmountain shelter, Harlan said, sitting heavily on the supply crate that had become his chair. There were 9 people there 2 days ago, 7 by the time we arrived. 2 turned in the night. May got the girl out. Phelan was already outside. He'd been sleeping in the tree line because the shelter was full. The 2 who turned, Colleen said. Were they bitten? Harlan met her eyes. No visible wounds. A silence filled the station that was different from all previous silences. The operating assumption, mine, at least, assembled from horror movies and video game logic and the first wave of emergency broadcasts, was that the wrongness spread through contact. Bite, scratch, fluid exchange. That was the model that lets you manage risk. Avoid contact, stay clean, maintain distance. If the wrongness could arrive without contact, if it was airborne or dormant or triggered by something environmental, then the station walls meant nothing. The mountain meant nothing. Altitude was not immunity. It was just distance, and distance without direction was just wandering. We don't know anything, Colleen said. 2 data points isn't a pattern. They could have been exposed before arriving at the shelter. Incubation period we don't understand. Don't spiral. She said it to the room, but she was looking at me, because I was the one most likely to spiral. I could feel it beginning, the centrifugal thinking, the widening gyre of what if, that pulled every stable thought outward toward panic. Wren was asleep on the cot. Wren was breathing. Wren could be incubating something I couldn't see or test or treat. May spoke for the first time since entering. She had a voice that carried the residual authority of someone accustomed to commanding a classroom of teenagers. I've been around over 50 people in the last 2 weeks. I've watched 11 of them turn. Every single one had been in direct physical contact with a turned individual within the previous 48 hours. I couldn't see wounds on all of them, but that doesn't mean wounds didn't exist. Bites on the torso, the back, under clothing. The shelter was close quarters. People were sleeping side by side. She paused. Contact is still the vector. I'd stake my professional reasoning on it. A chemistry teacher's professional reasoning was the closest thing to epidemiology we had. I took it. Not because it was conclusive, because it was functional. It gave me a framework that preserved agency. Contact could be avoided. Airborne could not. Phelan said nothing during this exchange. He'd positioned himself by the door, not near it, but with a sight line to it, as though maintaining a route of exit was more important than access to food or water. His eyes moved constantly, cataloging, measuring. When they landed on the rifle, they stayed a beat too long. 7 people now. 1 room. The food reprieve bought us time but compressed the space. The station was becoming something new. I didn't have a name for it yet. The demographics of the station as of day 19. 1 recording engineer who couldn't build a fire. 1 building inspector with a rifle. 1 veterinarian with a broken collarbone. 1 mute teenager who'd started speaking in fragments. 1 chemistry teacher with a 6-year-old who wasn't hers. One man of unknown background with exit-seeking eyes. One toddler who didn't cry, and one child who cried enough for both of them. Iris cried. She cried with the comprehensive, operational commitment of a 6-year-old who understands that something enormous has gone wrong and has decided that the appropriate response is to produce sound until the universe self-corrects. It was loud. It was unignorable. And it was, I realized, with a creeping, chemical dread audible outside the station walls. May handled it. She had developed a system that involved physical proximity, a specific low humming, and the strategic deployment of a small stuffed rabbit that Iris had been carrying in her jacket since day one. The rabbit's name was Doctor, and Doctor's therapeutic range was approximately 20 minutes, after which Iris would remember that her parents were gone and the cycle would restart. "I have to tell you something," May said to me on the night of day 20. We were the only ones awake. The informal watch system had evolved so that 2 people stayed conscious at all times, and the pairings rotated. About Iris's parents. I waited. Her mother was one of the 2 who turned at the shelter. Her father was the other. The weight of that settled onto the room's accumulated dread like a stone placed on a cairn. Both parents, within the same night, which meant either they'd both been exposed simultaneously or one had turned and infected the other before anyone realized what was happening. Either scenario suggested an intimacy to the transmission that made the close quarters of the station feel like a held breath. Does Iris know? She knows they're gone. She doesn't know the specifics. She was asleep when it happened. I got her out through the shelter's back opening before she saw anything. May's voice was level, practiced, the way teachers deliver difficult truths to administrative panels. She thinks they got sick. That's the word I used. Sick. Is that a lie or a translation? Both. All language about this is both. She looked at me with an expression I recognized the particular exhaustion of a person who has been making decisions on behalf of a child who isn't theirs and who has no legal, biological, or historical claim on their protection. I knew that expression because I'd seen it in mirrors, in car windows, in the black screen of a dead phone, every day since Dana died. The expression of a person who became a parent not through planning, but through proximity to catastrophe. How did you end up with her? I was at the shelter. Her parents arrived with the larger group from Spruce Pine. When the mother started showing symptoms, the jaw thing, the clicking, I was closest to the sleeping area. I grabbed Iris and ran. She paused. It wasn't heroic. It was geometric. I was nearest. I wanted to argue, to tell her that geometry didn't account for the decision to grab rather than flee. To burden yourself with 35 pounds of terrified child when unencumbered running was an option. But I understood the impulse to diminish your own choices. Calling it heroism meant accepting the weight of the ongoing obligation. Calling it geometry meant it was an accident, and accidents didn't bind you. Phelan, who I'd thought was asleep, spoke from his position by the door. "We need to talk about the noise." May stiffened. I turned. Phelan was sitting up, his damaged feet extended before him, his eyes fixed on the sleeping Iris with an expression that contained concern and something colder assessment. "She can't keep crying like that," he said. "It's going to bring them to us." "She's 6, May said. "She's a signal fire," Phelan said. "And we're all standing next to her." The room's temperature didn't change, but everything else did. The conflict didn't erupt. It calcified. Over the following days, Phelan's position hardened into a constant, low-pressure system that affected every interaction in the station without producing a visible storm. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply narrated the risk repeatedly, with the patient insistence of water-wearing stone. Heard clicking last night. South side, multiple sources. She was crying for 40 minutes this afternoon. Sound carries differently at altitude, less ambient noise to mask it. How many MREs now? 51? That's 7 days at current count, and 2 of our 7 people are consuming without contributing to security. He never named Iris directly. He never proposed a specific action. He spoke in logistics and physics and the cold language of resource management. And he let the implications assemble themselves in the minds of everyone listening. It was sophisticated. It was effective. And it was, I gradually realized, a form of violence committed entirely through arithmetic. Harlan shut it down on day 23. We were eating the evening meal, half an MRE each, supplemented by ramps that Harlan and Jerome had foraged from the north slope. Phelan made an observation about the sound insulation properties of the station walls, which was technically architectural commentary and practically a referendum on Iris's continued presence. Harlan set his spoon down. "I've been listening to you calculate for 3 days," he said. "You're not wrong about sound. You're not wrong about food. But you're heading somewhere with this. And I need you to say it out loud or stop walking toward it in the dark." Phelan's expression didn't change. It rarely did. His face operated in a narrow emotional band that I associated with professional poker or pharmaceutical sales. A calibrated neutrality designed to make the other person fill the silence with their own anxieties. "I'm saying what everyone's thinking," Phelan said. "Resources are finite. Risk is increasing. Some members of this group increase risk more than others." "She's a child," Colleen said from the cot, where she was helping Wren practice standing. "Children die in situations like this," Phelan said. "Pretending otherwise doesn't keep them alive. Honesty keeps them alive. The honest question is whether sheltering one child endangers another." He looked at Wren, then at me. The room contracted. I felt the hammer's handle against my palm before I realized I'd reached for it. Not a decision, a reflex. The animal beneath the narration, responding to a perceived threat to offspring with the only tool it trusted. "Nobody's going anywhere," Harlan said. "Not the girl, not the baby, not you." He looked at Phelan with the evaluative patience of a man who'd spent 31 years determining whether structures were sound. "But if you mention those children again in the context of liability, you'll be the one outside the fence. Am I clear?" Phelan held Harlan's gaze for 3 seconds, then picked up his spoon and resumed eating. The matter appeared settled. It was not settled. It was submerged, and submerged things don't dissolve, they wait. That night, May moved Iris's sleeping position from the center of the room to the corner farthest from the door, tucked behind the supply shelving. She arranged wool blankets to create a partial sound barrier. She gave Iris a double dose of the children's antihistamine from the medical kit, which induced drowsiness and reduced the crying jags. These were not solutions. They were concessions to Phelan's arithmetic disguised as maternal care. I found her at the sink afterward, dissolving powdered milk for Iris's morning ration. Her hands were trembling. I shouldn't have to drug a 6-year-old to keep her safe from the people who are supposed to be protecting her. "You're protecting her," I said. "I'm managing her. There's a difference." She dried her hands. Her parents turned, and I took her because I was nearest. And now I'm putting her to sleep with antihistamines because a man I don't know has decided she's a liability. What happens when the antihistamines run out? I didn't answer, because every answer I could construct led to the same door Phelan had been standing beside since he arrived. Day 26 was the first day we lost someone from inside the station. Not to the wrongness, to the mathematics. Phelan left at dawn. He took 4 MREs, 2 bottles of water, and the folding knife from the medical kit. He didn't take the rifle, which told me either he had a principle or he understood that attempting to take it from Harlan would end in a way that didn't favor his damaged feet. He left a note, written in pencil on the back of one of the laminated emergency protocol cards. Going down. Heard a broadcast about a FEMA camp near Irwin. Better odds, no hard feelings. Good riddance, Colleen said, reading it. Harlan said nothing. He took the note, folded it, and placed it in his jacket pocket. Then he did the morning perimeter check alone, 20 minutes longer than usual. And when he came back, his face held the particular stillness of a man who has found something he's deciding whether to share. Tracks, he said. South tree line, fresh, multiple sets, not human gait. The wrong ones walked differently. I'd seen it only once at the clicking woman, but Harlan had observed dozens. He described their movement as a kind of purposeful drift, weight distributed unevenly, stride lengths irregular but direction consistent. They didn't wander. They moved toward stimuli, and then they stopped. And their stopped posture was the most disturbing element. Upright, still, oriented toward whatever had drawn them, waiting with a patience that no living human body could replicate. How many? I asked. 4 sets, maybe 5. Overlapping, hard to distinguish. He unslung the rifle and checked the chamber. They came in from the southwest, circled the station at a distance of about 40 yards, and continued northeast along the ridge. Continued, May said. Past us? This time. The implication was architectural, in Harlan's vocabulary. The structure was known. Its location had been noted in whatever collective navigation system the wrong ones operated by pheromone, sound memory, some sense we didn't have a name for. They'd circled and moved on. But the circling meant reconnaissance, and reconnaissance meant return. We need to think about leaving, May said. The word struck the room like a tuning fork. Leaving. The station had become, in 26 days, more than shelter. It was identity. We were the station people. Our survival was the station's survival. To leave was to dissolve the only structure that had kept 7, now 6 people breathing. And go where? I said. Cumberland Gap. The Ranger transmission. 11 souls they were organized, they were holding. May had been listening to the radio more intently than any of us, building a mental map of signals and silences. Last transmission was 9 days ago, but the signal was strong. Fixed antenna, likely solar-powered. That's infrastructure. That's permanence. Cumberland Gap is 50 miles south, Harlan said. Through valleys, through towns. With a toddler, a 6-year-old, a woman with a broken collarbone, and a teenager who just started eating again. In terrain where 5 of them are circling our building. Staying is slower dying, May said. Leaving is faster risk. But faster risk has an end point. Slower dying doesn't. Jerome, who had been sitting against the wall reading the laminated protocol cards for the 4th time, looked up. I know the route, he said. My mom and I used to drive to the Gap for the music festival. There's a fire road that runs the ridge south from here to Iron Mountain. Mostly above 4,000 feet. Fewer towns, fewer people, fewer of them. I looked at Wren, sleeping in the carrier. 14 months old. 40 days on this mountain, give or take. The only world she'd remember would be the one I built for her next. We stay, I said. We fortify. We make this place louder on the outside and quieter on the inside. We make the cost of coming for us higher than the reward. Harlan looked at me as though seeing a load-bearing wall where he'd expected drywall. "Tell me how," he said. I did. The plan came from the only expertise I had: sound. I was a recording engineer. I understood acoustics, signal propagation, frequency response, and the way physical environments shape the behavior of waves traveling through air. I had spent 15 years learning how to control what people heard and when they heard it. The wrong ones were stimulus-driven. Harlan's observations confirmed this. Sound drew them. Motion held them. The clicking nurse had been transfixed by the anemometers spinning. The groups that circled the station had followed a path consistent with tracking a sound source. If they could be drawn, they could be redirected. The station's instrument towers held components I could repurpose: anemometers, wind vanes, rain gauges, mechanical devices designed to interact with the environment and produce measurable responses. The anemometer that had fascinated the clicking woman generated a rhythmic whirring proportional to wind speed. At altitude, with the persistent ridgeline winds, that sound was constant and directional. I proposed a perimeter of sound, not a wall, a channel. Using components from the towers, repositioned at intervals along the tree line south and west of the station, I could create a gradient of acoustic stimulation that would draw the wrong ones along a path that curved away from the station and continued northeast along the ridge. A sonic detour. The anemometers and loose vane assemblies would generate wind-activated noise that was more interesting than the quiet building behind the fence. Harlan understood immediately. The man who read structures saw the logic in redirecting flow. "You're building a drainage system," he said, "but for attention instead of water." Exactly. The station becomes a dead zone, minimal sound, minimal visual stimulus. The instrument line becomes the attractive nuisance. They follow the gradient away from us. "What do you need?" I needed time outside the fence. I needed Jerome's knowledge of the terrain. I needed Colleen's mechanical precision, because setting bone and setting equipment weren't fundamentally different skills. I needed May to keep the children silent while we worked. We started on day 27. Jerome and I dismantled the secondary instrument tower, the one farthest from the station building, and recovered 4 anemometer assemblies, 2 wind vane units, and a collection of aluminum crossbars that could serve as mounting poles. Colleen, working one-handed but effective, fabricated mounting brackets from the chain-link fence material we cut from the far side of the perimeter, the side facing away from the approach paths. The work took 3 days. 3 days of exposure, of carrying metal through the woods, of driving makeshift stakes into rocky soil with the claw hammer while scanning the tree line for movement. Jerome was the scout. He'd climb ahead, position himself on a rise, and whistle a specific pattern if the route was clear. 1 whistle for safe, 2 for hold, 3 meant run. He whistled 3 on the afternoon of day 28. We were 200 yards from the station, setting the 3rd anemometer on a pole wedged between rocks. I heard the triple whistle and my body responded. Before my mind engaged, I dropped the crossbar and moved toward the station, staying low, keeping trees between me and the direction Jerome was facing. I didn't see it clearly. A shape between the trunks, 60 yards downslope, moving with that purposeful drift Harlan had described. Then a second shape. Then a sound not clicking this time, but a low, sustained moan that had no communicative content, no emotional texture, just raw vocalization from a mechanism that had forgotten why it had a voice. Jerome appeared beside me, breathing hard, gripping the aluminum pole like a spear. 2 of them, he whispered. They're moving east, following the first anemometer. We watched. The shapes moved through the trees, angling toward the spinning device we'd mounted that morning. They reached it. They stopped. They stood beneath the whirring mechanism and looked up, transfixed, their bodies swaying slightly in the wind, as though they were listening to music only their damaged systems could process. The anemometer held them for 22 minutes before the wind shifted and they drifted with it, continuing northeast. It worked. The theory was sound. I allowed myself to believe we might survive this. By day 31, the full acoustic perimeter was installed. 7 stations, I refused to call them anything else, because naming them after what they deterred would have meant naming what I was most afraid of. Arranged in a curving line from the southwest approach to a terminus point 300 yards northeast, where the ridge dropped off into a hollow. The wrong ones who approached from the populated valleys to the south would encounter the first station's noise, follow the gradient through successive stations, and be channeled away from the building and into terrain that led nowhere useful. It wasn't perfect. Wind-dependent meant variable. Calm days left the station silent, and on those days we retreated to the protocol of blackout material and whispered breath. But the ridgeline was rarely calm. Afternoon thermals pushed reliably from the west, and the anemometers spun with gratifying consistency. What I didn't anticipate was the effect on us, not the safety, the sound. For 31 days, our survival strategy had been silence, suppression, the damping of every human noise to a level below detection. Wren's uncanny quiet, Iris's medicated drowsiness, our whispered conversations and careful footsteps and held breath, all of it, had compressed us into something smaller than human. A colony of held sounds waiting to be released. The acoustic perimeter reversed the dynamic. The outside was now the noisy space. The station became, by contrast, a pocket of intentional silence, but chosen silence, not terrified silence. The distinction mattered. We could speak, not shout. The wrong ones were stimulus responsive, not deaf, but talk, at normal volume, for the first time in a month. Iris spoke first. Not a cry, a question. "May, why do the spinny things make noise?" May looked at me. I knelt down to Iris's height, which I hadn't done before because previous interactions with the children had been logistical rather than conversational. "They're catching the wind," I said. "The wind pushes them around and they spin, and spinning makes a sound." "Like a pinwheel?" "Exactly like a pinwheel. My dad had a pinwheel in the garden. It was silver and blue." Her face did the thing children's faces do when memory intersects with loss, a flicker of brightness collapsing into confusion. Because the past tense of a living parent is a grammatical structure no 6-year-old should have to conjugate. "That sounds like a good pinwheel," I said. It was an inadequate response. Everything I could have said would have been inadequate. Language has no tool for bridging the gap between a child's memory and a child's reality when the two have been separated by catastrophe. Colleen's collarbone was healing. She announced this on day 32 with the clinical satisfaction of a professional observing her own recovery with the same detachment she'd apply to a patient. The fracture had been clean, the immobilization effective, and the bone was knitting in alignment. She removed the sling, tested range of motion, and declared herself at 60%. 60% of a horse vet is still more useful than 100% of most people, Harlan observed. And Colleen almost smiled, which was the closest thing to levity the station had produced in 32 days. Jerome was changing fastest. The silent boy who'd arrived with dead eyes was becoming someone else, or becoming, perhaps, who he'd been before his mother stopped being his mother. He took over the morning perimeter checks. He maintained the acoustic stations, replacing components that loosened in storms, adjusting angles for optimal wind capture. He carried Ren on the checks sometimes, strapped to his chest in the carrier, and he narrated the world tour in a low, steady voice. That's a spruce, that's a birch. Those are clouds, and those ones mean rain. He was teaching her the mountain. He was teaching himself that the mountain could still be taught, that it remained a place of knowledge and seasons and identifiable things, not just a landscape of wrongness and dread. I watched him walk the fence line with my daughter, and I felt the wall I'd been building between who I was and who I was becoming develop its first crack. Day 34 should have been the day we starved. Harlan's original math had been precise. But the foraging, the trade goods from the shelter, the rice and canned food May's group had carried these interventions had extended the timeline. We were thin. We were hungry in the persistent, humming way that becomes a frequency your body broadcasts constantly. But we were alive, and the acoustic perimeter was holding. And for 3 consecutive days, no wrong ones had been sighted within the fence lines to his view. On day 35, the radio changed everything. I was scanning frequencies, a habit that had become meditative. The slow sweep across the band producing mostly static, with occasional ghost signals that resolved into nothing. Then, at 151.625 megahertz, a voice. Female, calm, professional. This is Blue Ridge Emergency Network Station Juliet 7, broadcasting from Grandfather Mountain. We are a coalition of 11 settlements spanning the Northern Carolina Highlands. If you are receiving this transmission, you are not alone. Repeat, you are not alone. We are coordinating supply routes, medical resources, and defensive infrastructure across a 40-mile corridor. If you can transmit, respond on this frequency. If you can only receive, proceed to any of the following waypoints for intake processing. She listed coordinates. She listed settlement names. She listed protocols for approach identification procedures, quarantine requirements, integration steps. It was organized. It was bureaucratic. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard, because bureaucracy meant continuity. And continuity meant that somewhere, the species had decided to administer itself back into existence. Harlan wrote down every coordinate. May plotted them against Jerome's knowledge of the terrain. Colleen calculated travel times, factoring in her shoulder, the children, and the need to move at the pace of the slowest member. Grandfather Mountain is 28 miles southeast, Jerome said. But one of the waypoints is on Roan High Knob. That's 6 miles from here. Same ridge, mostly above tree line. 6 miles. 1 day's walk. Carrying 2 children with a rifle and a hammer and the accumulated knowledge of 40 days of surviving what shouldn't have been survivable. It could be a trap, Harlan said. Not because he believed it, but because his function in the group had become the stress testing of hope. He applied the same skeptical pressure to good news that building inspectors apply to load-bearing claims. It's on 151.625, May said. That's a VHF emergency frequency, legitimate infrastructure. You don't broadcast on that band unless you have equipment and authority. Authority doesn't exist anymore, Harlan said. Then someone's rebuilding it, May replied. And I'd rather walk toward that than sit here counting MREs. The vote wasn't formal. We didn't raise hands or tally positions. It happened the way decisions happen in small groups that have survived together long enough to develop a shared nervous system through glances, nods, the subtle redistribution of weight that indicates a body preparing to move. Jerome looked at me. I looked at Ren, who was sitting on the floor examining her own hands with the philosophical intensity of someone encountering a new idea. We go, I said. It wasn't a brave decision. It wasn't a calculated decision. It was the recognition that the station had done what it could. The concrete walls and acoustic perimeters and rationed MREs had carried us to this point, but could not carry us further. And that the next phase of survival required something the station couldn't provide: other people, more than 6, a number large enough to absorb loss without dissolution, a number that could sustain the failure of any individual member, including me, without the structure collapsing. I was a recording engineer. I understood that a single instrument, no matter how well played, eventually runs out of range. What I was hearing on that radio frequency was an orchestra tuning up, dissonant and imperfect and alive. We would leave at dawn, day 37. But first, we had 2 days to prepare, and the mountain had one more lesson to teach me about the cost of the person I had become. On day 36, I found a grave behind the station. Not a recent one, not one of ours. It was tucked against the north wall of the building, where the concrete met the slope and rhododendron grew thick enough to conceal a depression in the earth that I'd walked past 40 times without noticing. Jerome found it. Actually, he'd been clearing brush to improve the sightline, and his machete, a tool Harlan had fashioned from a shelf bracket with a sharpened edge, struck something solid 6 inches down. A wooden marker, hand-carved. The letters were crude but legible. Ruth Avery Cole, 1947 to 2019. She watched the weather, and the weather watched back. Beneath the marker, wrapped in degraded plastic sheeting, was a metal box. Inside the box, a journal, a set of keys, and a photograph of a woman in her 70s standing beside the station's instrument tower, squinting into the sun with the proprietary satisfaction of someone standing next to something they'd built. The journal explained everything. Ruth Cole had been a NOAA volunteer observer, one of thousands of civilians who maintained weather monitoring stations across the country. She'd staffed this station for 37 years, driving up the mountain 3 times a week to record temperature, precipitation, wind speed, barometric pressure. She'd done it through blizzards and budget cuts and the slow erosion of institutional interest in manual weather observation. In 2015, NOAA had decommissioned the station. Automated systems, satellite networks, the usual narrative of efficiency replacing presence. Ruth was given a certificate and thanked for her service. She kept coming. She drove up the mountain and recorded the weather in her journal because the mountain deserved a witness. And she had decided that she was it. The supplies, the MRS, the water, the medical kit were hers. Not emergency preparedness, not survivalist anxiety, something simpler and stranger. Ruth had been stalking the station for years because she intended to die there. The journal made this clear in the plain, unsentimental language of a woman who had outlived her husband, her siblings, and her interest in the valley below. She wanted to spend her final winter on the mountain, watching the weather one last time. The supplies were for comfort during the dying. She died in 2019, in her home in Burnsville, before she could execute the plan. Her nephew had buried her ashes here, beside the station, with the marker and the box. The keys were to the padlock I'd broken. I sat on the ground beside Ruth Cole's grave and read her journal while my group packed supplies for the morning departure. She had recorded decades of observations, temperature highs and lows, snowfall totals, the dates when certain wildflowers bloomed at altitude, the behavior of ravens and thermal updrafts, the exact shade of sunset on winter solstice as viewed from the station's doorway. She had watched the world, not managed it, not survived it, not optimized it. Watched it, with patience and precision, and the profound, unfashionable belief that paying attention was itself a form of care. I had spent 40 days in her station calculating survival, counting MREs, measuring risk, doing arithmetic on human lives. I had opened my door to Harlan because he had a rifle. I had weighed Jerome's usefulness against his caloric cost. I had heard a father begging for help on the radio and stayed silent because the math didn't justify the risk. Ruth Cole had spent 37 years climbing a mountain to write down the temperature because someone should. I closed the journal. I placed it back in the box. I left the box open beside her marker because a thing that had been buried and found should stay found. Then I went inside and told Colleen about the man on the radio. The one from Carver's Gap, the father with the broken ankle and the 9-year-old boy. I told her I'd heard him on day 6 and done nothing. She listened. She didn't forgive me because forgiveness wasn't hers to give. But she looked at me with the clinical clarity of a woman who'd spent her career assessing damage and said, "Now you know." We left the station on the morning of day 37, with everything we could carry and nothing we could afford to leave behind. Harlan took the rifle and the remaining MREs. Jerome carried Wren in the chest carrier, a configuration we'd tested and found more efficient than my carrying her, because Jerome was taller and his stride covered more ground with less energy per step. I hated it. The animal in me hated seeing my daughter on someone else's chest. The father in me recognized that the animal's instincts were not always the best operational guide. May carried Iris on her back, using a harness Colleen had improvised from backpack straps and wool blanket material. Colleen carried the medical kit and the water filtration system. I carried the radio, the remaining water, and the hammer, which had become less a tool than a talisman, the object I'd held when I broke the padlock, when I defended the door, when I sat in the dark doing the calculations I was now ashamed of. The morning was clear. The ridgeline stretched south-southeast in a series of grassy balds interspersed with spruce fir thickets, the trail visible as a worn line through the vegetation. Jerome led. Harlan walked rear guard. The rest of us moved in the middle, a formation that looked, I realized, like something Harlan had designed. The children and the injured at the center, the armed and the able at the edges. We were a structure. We were engineered. The first 2 miles passed without incident. The acoustic stations I'd built were visible from the trail aluminum poles glinting in the sun, anemometers spinning steadily in the morning wind. I watched them as we passed, feeling the strange pride and stranger guilt of leaving behind a system that had kept us alive. Someone else might find it. Someone else might understand what the spinning things were for. Mile 3 brought the tree line. The balds ended and the trail descended into a stand of red spruce, so dense that the canopy blocked the sky. The temperature dropped 5 degrees. The wind died. The acoustic world changed no more open-air clarity, just the close, muffled quality of sound in a dense forest where every surface absorbed rather than reflected. Jerome stopped. He raised a fist, a gesture Harlan had taught him. Military hand signals adapted for civilian use. We stopped. I listened. Clicking. Distant but present. Multiple sources, impossible to localize in the acoustic maze of tree trunks and root systems. Harlan moved forward to Jerome's position. They consulted in whispers I couldn't hear. Then Jerome turned and pointed east off the trail, upslope, toward a rock outcrop that rose above the tree line. We climbed. Iris whimpered against May's back, and May hummed the melody that had become their shared language. A frequency of comfort broadcast at a volume I prayed was below the detection threshold of the things in the trees below. From the outcrop, we could see them. 7 no. 9 figures moving through the spruce stand in a loose cluster, heading north along the trail we'd been walking. They moved with the purposeful drift, the irregular stride, the upright stillness when they paused to process some stimulus invisible to us. One of them, a tall figure in what appeared to be a park ranger's uniform, stopped directly beneath our position and tilted its head upward. Ren was silent. Iris was silent. The mountain was silent. The ranger figure held its upward gaze for 11 seconds. Then something in the north, one of my acoustic stations perhaps, catching a gust, produced a distant whirring, and the figure's head snapped toward it. The cluster moved. They continued north, following the sound gradient I'd designed, channeled by an architecture they couldn't understand, away from the people it was built to protect. I watched them go, and I thought of Ruth Cole, who had watched the weather, and I thought of the man from Carver's Gap, who I hadn't watched at all. And I understood that the distance between witness and coward was measured not in miles, but in the decision to look. We descended the outcrop and continued south. Rowan High Knob appeared at mile 5.5. A fire tower stood on the summit, skeletal and rusted, and beside it a newer structure, a communications shelter with a solar panel array on its roof and an antenna that explained the signal strength of the broadcast we'd received. A flag hung from the antenna mast, plain white, no markings, the universal semaphore of "We are here and we are not hostile." A woman stood at the base of the tower. She was holding a clipboard in the apocalypse, which told me more about the organizational culture of the Blue Ridge Emergency Network than any radio broadcast could have. Behind her, 2 men with hunting rifles stood at relaxed attention, scanning the tree line with the practiced alertness of people who had been doing this long enough to develop efficient habits. "How many?" the woman called as we approached. "6, Harlan called back. 2 children, 1 recovering injury." "Weapons?" "1 rifle, 1 hammer." I saw her write this down, on the clipboard, in pen, the bureaucracy of survival, and it was glorious. The intake process took 2 hours. They checked us for bite marks, scratches, any wound that might indicate exposure. Colleen submitted to this examination with the wry patience of a professional having her work evaluated by colleagues. They tested our temperatures with a forehead thermometer that still worked, powered by batteries that someone had thought to stockpile. They asked questions where we'd come from, how many we'd been, how many we'd lost. I told them about the station, about Ruth Cole's supplies, about the acoustic perimeter. The woman with the clipboard stopped writing and looked at me. "You're the sound guy?" "I'm a recording engineer." We've had 3 groups come through from the north in the last week. 2 of them mentioned a line of spinning things on the ridge that the infected followed instead of the trail. "That was you?" I nodded. "You may have saved more people than you know," she said. The words landed on the guilt I carried like water on an oil fire, spreading it rather than extinguishing it. Because for every person the acoustic perimeter had inadvertently protected, there was a father at Carver's Gap I'd chosen not to walk toward. The math of my contribution would never balance, because moral accounting doesn't work like supply inventory. You don't get to offset the people you abandoned against the people you accidentally saved. They fed us. Real food, canned stew heated on a propane burner. Bread baked that morning from flour someone had found in a restaurant supply warehouse. Chadurer, Iris ate without stopping until May gently removed the bowl. Jerome ate slowly, deliberately, tasting each bite with the concentration of someone relearning that food was a pleasure and not merely a function. Ren ate mashed bread soaked in stew broth. And for the first time since the station, she made a sound that wasn't a question or a silence. She laughed, a small sound, brief, barely more than a voiced exhalation. But it contained all the acoustic properties of genuine amusement, the rising pitch, the rhythmic pulsing, the involuntary quality that distinguished real laughter from performed laughter. The recording engineer in me analyzed its waveform. The father in me dissolved. Harlan sat apart, eating his stew, watching the perimeter guards with the evaluative gaze of a man assessing structural integrity. After a while, he walked to the communications shelter and asked to use the radio. He gave a call sign I didn't recognize and spoke into the microphone with a voice I hadn't heard him use before, uncertain, almost young. "This is Harlan Gear, calling for David Gear in Portland. If anyone can relay to the Pacific Northwest Network, tell him his father's alive. Tell him I'm sorry about whatever I did that I was too stubborn to name. Tell him I'm on Roan High Knob, and I'm going to keep being alive until he can yell at me in person." He set down the microphone and walked outside and stood in the wind. And nobody followed him because some silences are structural and load-bearing and shouldn't be disturbed. We stayed on Roan High Knob for 3 days before joining a convoy south to the Grandfather Mountain settlement. 11 settlements had become 14 by the time we arrived. The network was growing not by design, but by accretion, the way rivers form, each tributary finding its way to the main channel through the path of least resistance. I work in communications now. Sound systems, signal relay, acoustic infrastructure. The thing I knew how to do before the world ended turned out to be the thing the new world needed. Ruth Cole watched the weather because someone should. I manage what people hear because someone must. Jerome is 19. He's training as a scout. He still carries Wren sometimes, on his back now that she's bigger, narrating the world in his steady voice. "That's a hawk. That's granite. Those clouds mean nothing dangerous. I never found the man from Carver's Gap." I check every intake roster. I describe him to every new arrival, a man with a broken ankle and a 9-year-old boy. Last heard on day 6. Frequency unknown. Voice terrified. Nobody recognizes the description. Nobody has heard the transmission. Some debts don't resolve. You carry them at altitude, where the air is thinner and the weight is heavier. And you keep climbing because the alternative is to set them down. And setting them down would mean becoming someone who could forget. I don't forget. I listen. The wind doesn't stop on this ridge. It never has. Ruth Cole could have told you that.